My name is Emily Carter. I'm 30 years old, and for most of my life I've been chasing the impossible dream of earning my parents' respect. Tonight, in the warm glow of a Portland restaurant, I thought maybe, just maybe, I could stop chasing. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this channel if you believe stories of resilience and truth deserve to be heard. The Garden Loft in downtown Portland shimmered that evening. Strings of fairy lights draped across the ceiling, candles flickered on gold-rimmed tables, and roses filled the air with a faint sweetness. It was my engagement party. Michael, my fiancé, stood beside me, tall and calm, his hand brushing against the small of my back, reminding me that I wasn't alone. Friends laughed at nearby tables, co-workers raised glasses, and even distant relatives seemed to smile in genuine warmth. For once, the room felt like it belonged to me. At the corner table sat my parents and my younger sister Sophie. Mom, Linda, wore her signature pearl necklace, posture stiff, her expression unreadable. Dad, Robert, kept his eyes down, swirling his wine as if it held the answers to questions he didn't dare speak. Sophie scrolled her phone with the kind of detachment only she could manage, as though my celebration was a tedious appointment on her calendar. Still, I clung to hope. Maybe tonight would be different. The chime of silver against crystal cut through the chatter. Linda stood, glass raised, her voice polished and confident. First, let me congratulate my daughter Emily and her fiancé Michael. May your marriage be filled with joy and stability. Polite applause rippled. My chest loosened just a little. Then her tone shifted, cold, deliberate. However, Robert and I have made a decision. The $60,000 we set aside years ago will no longer be used for Emily's wedding. Instead, it will go to her sister, Sophie. The room froze. A fork clattered onto a plate. I laughed softly, expecting the tension to dissolve. That's a good one, Mom. But you know that money is already in my account. Michael and I have budgeted every detail around it. Her eyes sharpened, lips pressing into a thin line. This isn't a joke, Emily. Your sister needs the support more urgently. Her fiancé is struggling to build his business, and she deserves a fair start. The heat rushed to my face. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I've saved carefully, Mom. Sophie had the same amount and spent it recklessly. I'm not responsible for her mistakes. Sophie's chair screeched against the floor as she shot up, glaring at me across the table. Stop acting so self-righteous, Emily. You've had everything handed to you. You never once offered to help when I asked. The words sliced through me, but anger steadied my spine. I planned. I sacrificed. That's the only difference. Linda's cheeks flared crimson. She closed the distance between us, eyes burning. Then, before I could brace, her hand whipped across my face. The sound cracked like thunder in the hushed room. My cheek burned hot, tears pricking not from pain but from humiliation. Dozens of eyes locked on us, some horrified, some too stunned to move. Even the string quartet faltered into silence. For years I had swallowed her cruelty, hoping patience might soften her. But in that moment, something inside me snapped. I straightened, voice trembling yet unmistakably clear. You don't get to hit me, not anymore. With the room watching, I pulled my phone from my clutch and dialed. My fingers barely shook. Hello, yes, Portland Police. I'd like to report an assault at the Garden Loft. Gasps rippled through the guests. Michael reached for me, his voice low, steady. I'm right here. You're not alone. Linda's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing with words that never came. Sophie shifted uncomfortably, fury clashing with disbelief. Robert finally looked up, his face pale, lips pressed tight, but he said nothing. Around us, voices erupted, Jenna, my best friend, muttering, "Unbelievable," while a cousin near the bar shouted, "That's crossing the line, Linda!" The private family war I had carried in silence for decades was now public, undeniable. The weight of their stares didn't crush me. It freed me. As murmurs grew, I pressed the cold glass of water against my stinging cheek, the ice melting fast. Outside, I could already hear faint sirens weaving through the Portland streets, growing louder by the second. For the first time, I felt something stronger than shame: determination. This wasn't just about wedding funds or favoritism. It was about refusing to be silenced. And as the sirens drew near, I knew the night that was meant to celebrate love had transformed into the night I finally decided to fight back. The wail of sirens grew sharper until the red-blue glow splashed across the tall windows of the garden loft. Every eye in the restaurant shifted toward the entrance, and for a second it felt as though the entire city had been invited into my humiliation. 2 Portland police officers stepped inside. The taller one spoke with practiced calm. "We received a report of an assault. Who placed the call?" My throat tightened, but I raised my hand. "I did. It was me." Gasps followed. Linda froze, her hand trembling as she tried to adjust her pearl necklace, as if clinging to an image of control. Sophie muttered under her breath, "This is ridiculous." Robert remained seated, his silence louder than any protest. The officer gestured for me to step aside. "Miss, can you explain what happened?" I touched my cheek, still burning. "My mother struck me, in front of everyone here." A low murmur rippled across the tables. One of my coworkers whispered, "I saw it, clear as day." Others nodded, voices rising. Jenna spoke firmly. "She hit her. We all saw it." For the first time, I realized I wasn't the only witness of my pain. Linda's voice cracked as she stepped forward. "This is a private family matter. My daughter is exaggerating." "Family or not, ma'am, physical assault is against the law," the officer replied evenly. The tension snapped like a taut wire. Sophie lunged with words sharper than any slap. "You just love making yourself the victim, don't you, Emily? You'll ruin Mom's life just because you can't share for once." Michael's hand rested on my arm before I could answer. His voice was calm but carried weight. "No one ruins their own life by protecting themselves. Emily doesn't owe anyone her silence." The officers exchanged looks. One quietly began taking notes, speaking with witnesses, while the other asked Linda to step outside. The sight of my mother being escorted through the elegant dining room, her posture stiff but her eyes darting nervously, was surreal. The same woman who had ruled our household through dominance now appeared smaller, stripped of the power she wielded so easily. As the doors closed behind them, the restaurant seemed to exhale all at once. Guests whispered, phones lit up. Someone had already started typing on social media. I overheard fragments. "Did you see that? She called the cops on her own mom. This is going to spread fast." And they were right. By the next morning, I knew the story would crawl beyond these walls, through Facebook groups, local news blogs, whispered conversations at coffee shops. It would no longer be our dirty secret. I pressed the cool glass of water against my cheek again, steadying myself. Inside, shame and relief wrestled for dominance. I hadn't wanted a scene, but I couldn't let her strike me and pretend nothing happened. Michael leaned close, his words low but unwavering. "You changed everything tonight, Emily. They can't bury this anymore." I met his eyes, and for the first time, I felt something unfamiliar but steady. I wasn't just surviving their cruelty, I was exposing it. As we stepped out into the Portland night, the city buzzed beyond the quiet street. I knew this wouldn't end here. The whispers, the judgment, the family backlash, it would all follow. But so would the truth, and that truth was finally mine. By the next morning, whispers had already spread beyond the walls of the garden loft. My phone buzzed nonstop. Texts, missed calls, screenshots of Facebook posts. A coworker forwarded me a community blog headline: "Family drama erupts at Portland engagement party. Police called." There it was. My name, my humiliation, no longer private. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. Truth was on my side. But truth doesn't travel as fast as rumor. By midweek, I noticed the shift at work. I'm a UX designer at a mid-sized tech firm in downtown Portland. Normally, my mornings start with casual chatter around the coffee station. That Monday, voices hushed the moment I entered. A junior developer gave me a sympathetic smile, but quickly looked away when another colleague approached. The silence was worse than any confrontation. In a conference room, while presenting a design mock-up, my manager, Kara, tapped her pen nervously. Afterward, she pulled me aside. "Emily, listen, I support you, but there's talk. Some clients saw the article. They're asking questions about your stability. I just want you to be prepared." Prepared, as if I hadn't been preparing my whole life to survive my family's storms. I nodded, keeping my voice even. "Thanks for letting me know." Inside, I was crumbling. Even Michael wasn't immune. One evening, he came home looking exhausted, tossing his bag onto the couch. "I got a call from a producer in Seattle. He said he received emails, supposedly from you, claiming I'd cheated. They're fake, but still, this could cost me a contract." My stomach dropped. Emails? Who would? I didn't finish. We both knew. Sophie. Michael rubbed his forehead. "I told them it's lies, but Emily, this is exactly what they want. To make us look unstable, unreliable." I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I walked to the window, watching the Portland rain streak the glass. My own sister was sabotaging not just me, but the man I loved. Nights grew heavier. Friends who once filled my weekends with dinners and movie nights began sending polite excuses. "Busy this week. Maybe another time." I understood too well. No one wants to be caught in the middle of a scandal. Even Jenna, my maid of honor, tried to reassure me but couldn't hide the tension. "I've defended you, Emily, but your mom's been calling people nonstop. She says you overreacted, that you're unstable. Some people believe her." Her words cut deeper than the slap had. My own mother rewriting the narrative, and strangers choosing her side. One Friday, I drove out to Sauvie Island just to breathe. I sat by the Columbia River, the water gray under the cloudy sky, trying to quiet the storm inside me. I replayed every moment, Linda's eyes blazing, Sophie's sneer, Robert's silence, a chorus of betrayal. I whispered to the river, as though confessing to a friend, why is responsibility seen as selfishness? Why is silence expected, but defense condemned? The water gave no answer, only the steady lap against the shore. When I returned home that evening, Michael was waiting with takeout containers and a quiet strength in his eyes. "We'll get through this," he said simply. He didn't offer false promises or dramatic speeches, just presence. It was enough to keep me standing. But deep down, I knew presence alone wasn't enough. My parents were escalating, Sophie was reckless, and the city was watching. If I didn't act, their lies would calcify into truth. I picked up my phone and stared at the number Aunt Margaret had given me weeks before. Claire Dawson, a lawyer with a reputation for tearing apart manipulation in family disputes. My thumb hovered, my pulse racing. I finally pressed dial. "Claire Dawson's office," a receptionist answered briskly. I inhaled, steadying my voice. "My name is Emily Carter. I think I need help." And just like that, the battle shifted. 2 days after that late-night phone call, I found myself walking up the narrow staircase of an old brick building in downtown Portland. A modest brass plaque beside the door read, "Dawson and Hale, Family Law." My palms were damp, my chest tight. I'd never stepped foot in a lawyer's office before, but desperation had pushed me here. The receptionist, a young man with round glasses, offered a polite smile. "Miss Carter, Claire will see you now." I followed him into a corner office with wide windows overlooking the Willamette River. Behind a walnut desk sat Claire Dawson, sharp navy suit, silver hair pulled back neatly, eyes that looked like they'd seen every kind of battle. She rose, shook my hand firmly, and gestured to a chair. "Emily, I've read a little from your voicemail. Why don't you tell me everything in your own words?" For the next 20 minutes, I poured it all out. The engagement party, my mother's slap, Sophie's sabotage, the fake emails, the whispers at work. Claire didn't interrupt. She scribbled notes occasionally, but mostly listened with a steady, unreadable expression. When I finally stopped, throat dry, she leaned back. "Your parents filed a petition last week. They're demanding control of the $60,000 fund, claiming it was intended strictly for education, not personal use." My stomach lurched. That's absurd. I've had legal access since I was 19. They never once said it was conditional. Claire nodded. Exactly, which is why their case is weak. What they're doing is intimidation. They're hoping you'll fold under the pressure. Anger surged through me. So they can hand everything to Sophie like always. Claire's gaze softened, but her voice stayed matter-of-fact. Emily, I've represented dozens of clients with families like yours. This isn't really about money. It's about control. You broke their script. That makes you dangerous to them. The truth of her words sank deep. I thought of Linda's eyes that night, furious not just at my refusal but at my defiance. What do I do? I asked quietly. Claire flipped through the folder she'd prepared. First, we document everything. Bank statements, the original transfer of funds, records of Sophie's spending if you have them. We'll also gather witness statements from the engagement party. If your mother struck you in public, that matters. It shows a pattern of aggression, not reason. The memory of Jenna's voice, we all saw it, flashed in my mind. For once, their silence might actually break in my favor. Claire closed the folder with a decisive thud. I'll be blunt. This will be messy. Your mother and sister will lie, and they'll lie convincingly. It will get uglier before it gets better. But if you're ready to fight, I'm ready to stand with you. For a long moment, I sat there, staring at the river beyond the window. Rain tapped against the glass in steady rhythms, like the universe whispering a challenge. Messy, ugly, painful. I had lived with that all my life. I lifted my chin. I'm ready. I can't let them erase me anymore. A rare smile tugged at Claire's lips. Good. Then let's get to work. As I left her office, clutching a folder heavier than it looked, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't in weeks. Resolve. For the first time, I wasn't just defending myself in whispers. I had a voice, an ally, and a plan. And I knew the courtroom would soon become the stage where all their lies unraveled. The courthouse in downtown Portland smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, like every secret the city had ever tried to bury still lingered in its walls. I sat on a stiff bench outside courtroom 3B, my palms pressed against the folder Claire had given me. Michael sat beside me, his hand covering mine, his quiet presence steadier than any words. Breathe, he whispered. I tried, but as the heavy oak doors opened and the bailiff called our case, my legs trembled anyway. Inside, the courtroom felt colder than the hallway, though sunlight spilled through tall windows. The judge, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, adjusted her glasses and looked over the docket. To her right sat my parents, Linda and Robert. Linda's chin was high, her lips curled into that familiar mask of superiority. Robert kept his gaze on the table, hands folded like a man praying for invisibility. Next to them sat Sophie, her posture confident, as if she were about to receive an award. Claire leaned toward me. Remember, stay calm. Let them bury themselves with their own lies. I nodded, though rage hummed beneath my ribs. The judge called us to order. Linda's attorney, a gray-haired man with a too-slick smile, began with an opening statement. Your Honor, the funds in question were intended for educational purposes only. My clients, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, entrusted this money to their daughter Emily with the expectation she would use it responsibly. Instead, she has hoarded it for personal gain while her younger sister Sophie is left without support. Objection, Claire cut in smoothly. Characterization. There were no conditions placed on the funds. The judge raised a hand. Noted. Continue. When it was Sophie's turn to speak, she rose eagerly. Emily has always acted like she's better than everyone else. She knew I was struggling, and she refused to help. That money was meant for education, not for her to play house with her fiancé. Her words were venom, but her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Claire stood slowly, her voice calm but edged with steel. Sophie, can you remind the court what school you attended? University of Washington, Sophie said confidently. And how many years did you complete? A flicker of hesitation. 2.5? And after leaving school, how did you spend the remainder of your fund? Claire's tone was mild, almost polite. Sophie's jaw tightened. I invested in a boutique. It just didn't work out. Claire flipped a page on her notes. Invested or spent? Records show you paid for multiple launch parties, influencer contracts, and purchased a luxury vehicle under your name. Is that correct? The silence stretched. Sophie's eyes narrowed, her voice clipped. That's irrelevant. On the contrary, Claire said, turning toward the judge, it proves the funds had no strict limitation. Both daughters were free to choose. One invested carefully, the other squandered. The plaintiff's claim that Emily violated an agreement is baseless because no such agreement existed. Linda's face flushed crimson. She suddenly stood, voice trembling with fury. Emily has always had more. She doesn't need that money. Sophie needs it now. As her mother, I have the right to decide what's fair. The judge's gavel struck once. Mrs. Carter, sit down. This is not about what you feel is fair. It's about the law. A murmur rippled across the small crowd of spectators. Neighbors, co-workers, even a local reporter I vaguely recognized. My humiliation had never been so public, but strangely, neither had my truth. When it was my turn, Claire gave me a nod. My legs wobbled as I stood, but my voice came out steady. Your Honor, my parents gave me that fund when I turned 19. I used part for tuition at Portland State and let the rest grow. I budgeted carefully because I knew I couldn't count on them forever. Now they want to take it back, not because of conditions, but because Sophie has spent hers. I'm not responsible for her choices. For the first time, the judge's expression softened. She scribbled something on her notepad. I sat down, breath shallow but unbroken. The hearing wrapped without a verdict, the judge announcing she would review the evidence further. Still, as we stepped out into the gray Portland afternoon, the air felt different, lighter. Michael slipped his arm around me. You were incredible in there. I exhaled shakily. I didn't feel incredible. I felt like I was on fire. Good, Claire said firmly, closing her briefcase with a snap. Fire burns through lies, and they just gave us plenty. For the first time in weeks, I felt it too. An ember of strength, glowing steady inside me. The battle wasn't over, but I wasn't hiding anymore. The weeks after the hearing blurred into a rhythm of wedding preparations and quiet exhaustion. Between work, paperwork for the case, and the constant tension with my family, I felt stretched thin. But every night, as Michael and I checked off tasks, flowers, menus, seating charts, I clung to the hope that our wedding day could still be ours, untouched. The morning of the rehearsal, the vineyard in Willamette Valley shimmered under pale spring sunlight. Rows of vines stretched like green ribbons against the hills, and for a moment I allowed myself to breathe. Security guards in black jackets stood near the entrance, hired after Claire insisted. Don't underestimate them, she had warned. Desperation makes people reckless. I didn't think she meant this reckless. That afternoon, while Jenna and I reviewed the ceremony order inside the bridal suite, there was a knock. One of the guards stepped in, his tone careful but urgent. Ms. Carter, we've intercepted someone at the service gate. My chest tightened. Who? He hesitated. Your sister, Sophie. She had a large tote bag. Inside was a gallon of red paint and brushes. The room tilted. Jenna muttered, Oh my God, her hand flying to her mouth. The guard continued. We stopped her before she reached the reception area. She claimed she just wanted to drop something off. We need instructions. I forced my legs to move. Outside, near the gravel path behind the vineyard kitchen, Sophie stood flanked by 2 guards. The bag lay open at her feet, the glaring red paint like a wound against the pale stones. Her eyes lit with defiance when she saw me. You don't get it, Emily. This wedding is a joke. You think you've won, but you'll always be alone. The rage I expected didn't come. Instead, a strange calm settled over me. I stepped closer, my voice low but steady. Do you even hear yourself? Sneaking in with paint to ruin my dress, my vows, everything I've built? That doesn't make me alone, Sophie. It proves how empty you feel. Her jaw clenched. You stole the spotlight. Mom and Dad... I cut her off, sharper this time. I didn't steal anything. I planned, I saved, I fought for the life I wanted. You burned through every chance handed to you, and now you want to burn mine too. But look around. I gestured at the guards, at Jenna hovering in shock behind me. No one is clapping for you anymore." For a heartbeat, something flickered in her expression, hesitation, maybe even shame. But just as quickly, it hardened back into anger. The head guard spoke firmly. "Ma'am, do you want to press charges?" The thought hung heavy. My mother's voice from years ago echoed, "Family keeps family's secrets." But then Claire's voice surfaced too. "Intimidation works only if you let it." I shook my head slowly. "Not today. Just escort her out. Make sure she doesn't come back." Sophie's laugh was brittle. "You think this is strength? No. You're still afraid to really fight me." I met her eyes one last time. "No, Sophie. I'm choosing not to sink with you." The guards guided her down the gravel path, her shoulders stiff, the red can swinging like a brand of failure. When she disappeared through the gate, Jenna exhaled shakily. "I don't know how you stayed so calm." I turned back toward the vineyard, the soft light spilling across the rows of vines. My heart still hammered, but the fear had loosened. "Because today isn't about her," I whispered. "It's about Michael and me, and I won't let her steal another moment." Inside, the rehearsal continued. Laughter, music, and the faint smell of wine filled the air, washing over the sharp sting Sophie had left behind. For the first time, I realized strength didn't always look like revenge. Sometimes, it was just refusing to hand over your joy. The morning sun spilled over the rolling hills of Willamette Valley, turning the vineyard into a canvas of soft gold and green. After the chaos of yesterday, the air felt impossibly calm, as though the earth itself had decided to guard this day for me. Inside the bridal suite, Jenna fussed with the last pins in my veil. Her hands trembled just slightly. "Still thinking about Sophie?" she asked gently. I caught her eyes in the mirror. "A little," I admitted, "but I won't let her be the headline today." She smiled. "Good, because the only story anyone should remember is that you chose love, even when they tried to drown it." A knock on the door interrupted us. When it opened, Uncle David, my father's younger brother, stood waiting in a crisp navy suit. His presence had always been steady, a quiet contrast to the storms in my family. "If you'll let me," he said softly, "I'd be honored to walk you down the aisle." My throat tightened. "I'd be grateful, Uncle David. Thank you." Moments later, as the music swelled outside, I stepped onto the stone path leading to the ceremony. Rows of white chairs framed the aisle, each draped with small bouquets of wildflowers. Guests rose, turning toward me, their faces illuminated with warmth rather than judgment. It struck me how different this crowd felt compared to that night in Portland. These people weren't here for spectacle. They were here for us. Uncle David offered his arm, and I took it, my knees steady despite the weight of memory. "Your parents' absence doesn't make this aisle any longer," he whispered. "It makes it lighter." I swallowed hard, the words sinking deep. Step by step, I felt myself shedding pieces of the old Emily, the one who bent under disapproval, who lived on the crumbs of conditional love. At the end of the aisle stood Michael, his eyes locked on mine, unwavering, pulling me forward with the kind of certainty I had always craved but never found in my own family. For a heartbeat, everything else, the lawsuit, the whispers, Sophie's sabotage, fell away. There was only him. The officiant welcomed everyone, her voice carrying gently in the open air. "Today, we gather not just to witness a marriage, but to celebrate resilience, loyalty, and the power of choosing one another." Michael squeezed my hands as he began his vows. His voice shook slightly, but his words were clear. "Emily, you are my anchor and my home. You've shown me what it means to stand tall even in the face of betrayal. I promise to guard your heart with mine, to honor your strength, and to walk beside you in truth." Tears blurred my vision. When it was my turn, I drew in a steady breath. "Michael, you've taught me that love doesn't demand silence or sacrifice. It thrives on respect. With you, I don't have to earn approval. I am enough. I promise to build a life with you that no rumor, no betrayal, no storm can shake." The officiant smiled warmly. By the power vested in me by the state of Oregon, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Applause erupted, cheers rising into the valley air. Michael kissed me, and the vineyard seemed to bloom brighter with the sound of joy. During the reception, laughter mingled with the clinking of glasses. Friends toasted to love, co-workers spoke of courage, and Aunt Margaret embraced me tightly. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "You've broken the cycle." Even the small band hired for the evening seemed to play with more spirit, as though the music itself carried relief. I danced barefoot under the string lights, the hem of my gown brushing the grass, Michael's hands steady around me. For the first time, I wasn't glancing over my shoulder, waiting for someone to ruin it. Later, as twilight deepened and lanterns glowed above the tables, Michael leaned close, his voice quiet against my ear. "They tried to take this from us, but look, we're here, together." I rested my forehead against his. "This is the real victory, isn't it? Not winning in court, not proving them wrong, just living free." He kissed me again, and for the first time in years, I believed it fully. The night ended with sparklers lining our exit, friends and family lifting them like stars to light our way. As Michael and I walked hand in hand toward the waiting car, the crowd cheered, not the hollow applause of obligation, but the raw, joyous sound of people who truly wished us happiness. Sliding into the back seat, I looked out the window one last time at the vineyard glowing against the dark hills. The girl who had once begged for her mother's approval was gone. In her place stood a woman who had chosen her own family, her own freedom, and that, I realized, was the greatest wedding gift of all. Just a month after Michael and I exchanged vows beneath the vineyard arch, whispers of another wedding began to dominate the family grapevine. This time, it was Sophie's turn. I wasn't invited, of course. Word came through cousins, old neighbors, even co-workers who delighted in sharing gossip. She's getting married in Napa Valley, Grand Oak Estate, gourmet chefs, champagne fountains, the whole 9 yards. At first, I thought it was just talk, but then photos surfaced online, a sprawling estate surrounded by vineyards, a marble staircase draped with imported roses, Sophie posing in a designer gown that looked like it belonged in a fashion spread. Michael caught me staring at one of the posts late at night. He touched my hand gently. "Don't let it eat at you. This isn't about you anymore." But in my gut, something twisted. I knew my parents couldn't afford this, not even close. That suspicion was confirmed the following week when Aunt Margaret called. "Emily," she said, her voice hushed but urgent, "your parents took out a massive loan against the house. They leveraged everything to fund Sophie's wedding." I sat in stunned silence, the receiver heavy in my hand. "They mortgaged the house?" "Yes," she said. "They think it's worth the risk. But Emily, it's reckless. If anything goes wrong, they could lose everything." The words clanged in my head as the days ticked toward Sophie's wedding. On the morning of the event, while I made coffee in my small Portland apartment, my phone buzzed with notifications. Social media was flooded, influencers tagged at the estate, guests snapping selfies by champagne fountains, posts captioned with hashtags like #WeddingOfTheYear. But alongside the glittering images, another story was breaking. A local business columnist had published an exposé. Carter family leverages property to fund $1 million wedding. The article detailed the loan, the precarious financial state of my parents, and the growing discontent among relatives who felt uncomfortable attending such extravagance, while whispers of foreclosure loomed. By the time the ceremony began, the scandal had already taken over the narrative. Guests at Grand Oak exchanged uneasy glances as murmurs rippled through the estate. A bridesmaid whispered to another, "Did you read that article? They mortgaged their house for this?" Someone at the bar muttered, "It's obscene." And Sophie, radiant in lace and diamonds, seemed oblivious, or maybe willfully blind. She walked down the marble staircase with Mom clutching her arm, chin high as though daring anyone to criticize her. Dad trailed behind, pale and sweating in his suit, his smile brittle. The vows were spoken, champagne flowed and music soared, but the mood had soured. I wasn't there, but family friends sent me messages in real time. One cousin texted, "Half the room is gossiping louder than the band. Even some vendors are laughing." Later that night, a video clip circulated online. Sophie tossing her bouquet, laughing dramatically, while in the background, two guests argued about the foreclosure article. The comments section exploded. Who spends money like this while their parents drown in debt? This is disgusting privilege. By the next morning, the so-called wedding of the year had turned into a public spectacle. Headlines mocked the Carters' fairy tale built on quicksand. The photos that Sophie and my mother had hoped would cement an image of perfection became memes instead, screenshots of the champagne fountain alongside the article's foreclosure headline. Michael scrolled through one of the articles, shaking his head. It's like they lit their own house on fire to keep Sophie warm for one night. I didn't laugh. My chest ached, not with jealousy, but with a heavy, complicated sadness. For so long, I had begged for even a fraction of their support. Now I watched them destroy themselves for her, and the world was finally noticing what I had lived all along. That evening, as the sun dipped behind Portland's skyline, I sat on our balcony and whispered more to myself than to Michael. They sacrificed their future for an illusion. He wrapped his arm around me. And you refused to. That's the difference. The difference was now public. For years I had been painted as selfish, cold, ungrateful. But now, under the glare of public humiliation, the truth was undeniable. Sophie's entitlement, Mom's blind favoritism, and Dad's silence had dragged them all into ruin. For the first time, I didn't have to defend myself. The world was doing it for me. The scandal from Napa Valley was still simmering when an unfamiliar number lit up my phone one quiet evening. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another reporter fishing for comments. But something in me hesitated before pressing accept. Emily. The voice was low, tired, and unmistakable. My father. I froze. Dad? There was a long pause, as if he had to gather courage just to continue. Could we meet? Somewhere private. I need to talk to you. We chose a small diner off Barber Boulevard, the kind of place where no one asked questions and the coffee was always lukewarm. When I arrived, Robert was already there, hunched over a chipped mug, his suit jacket draped carelessly across the booth. He looked older, smaller, as if the lavishness of Napa had drained him rather than lifted him. "Thank you for coming," he murmured when I slid into the seat across from him. I studied him carefully. "You sound different." He let out a brittle laugh. Different? More like hollow. The house is gone, Emily. We couldn't keep up with the payments after the loan for Sophie's wedding. The bank foreclosed last week. The words landed like stones, but I didn't flinch. I had already suspected as much. I know, I said quietly. I read the reports. His shoulders sagged further. Your mother refuses to admit any of it. She says it was worth it, that Sophie's happiness mattered more than a house. But I can't keep pretending. Not anymore. For the first time, his eyes lifted to meet mine. Wet, bloodshot, but honest. I was a coward, Emily. I let your mother's voice drown mine out for years. I watched her favor Sophie, dismiss you, twist every sacrifice you made into selfishness. And I stayed silent because it was easier, because I hated conflict more than I loved justice. I swallowed hard. Part of me wanted to spit back the years of hurt. Easier for you, unbearable for me. But his trembling hands on the table stopped me. Why now? I asked. Why speak up only after everything's already fallen apart? He pulled a small envelope from his jacket pocket and pushed it across the table. Inside were photocopies of financial documents, bank records, fund transfers that clearly showed the $60,000 had been given to me outright, no conditions. I've had these for years, he admitted. I knew they proved the money was yours. Last month I sent duplicates anonymously to your lawyer. Claire never knew it was me. That's why she was so confident in court. Shock rippled through me. That was you? He nodded slowly. It's the only way I knew how to help without setting your mother off. But it isn't enough. So I'm here to tell you in person. I'm sorry, Emily, for every time I didn't defend you, for every moment I chose silence. I can't undo it, but I can tell the truth now. My throat ached with emotions I hadn't expected. Anger, grief, but also a fragile thread of relief. This wasn't absolution, but it was something. I appreciate you telling me, I said carefully. But you need to understand, words don't erase the years. If you want a relationship with me, you'll have to prove it, day by day. His eyes glistened. I will, if you'll let me try. The diner's neon lights flickered against the window, casting a strange glow over his worn face. For the first time in my life, my father didn't look like a shadow behind my mother. He looked like a man stepping out, shakily, into the light. Not long after my meeting with Dad at the diner, word spread quietly through the family that Robert had begun distancing himself from Mom's narrative. He wasn't loud about it. He was never loud. But he stopped defending her at gatherings, stopped repeating the lines she fed him, and that silence spoke louder than anything else. Linda, of course, noticed. One afternoon, Aunt Margaret hosted a small family lunch in Lake Oswego. I didn't attend, but Margaret later called me with a recap. "Your mom tried to hold court at the table," she said, voice heavy with both pity and exasperation. But people didn't nod along this time. They questioned her. She snapped. Through Margaret's account, I could almost see it. Linda in her bright floral blazer, smile stretched too thin, insisting, "The article exaggerated. The bank will work with us. Sophie deserves that wedding. Every penny was worth it." But cousins exchanged glances. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably, and even old friends who once sang her praises muttered under their breath. Someone finally asked, "And what about Emily? Doesn't she deserve anything?" Margaret said. Linda's face hardened. She set down her fork with a clatter. "Emily has always had more than enough. She doesn't need sympathy." The room fell into a stunned silence, the kind that reveals how far someone has drifted from reality. Later that week, I saw it myself. I stopped by a grocery store near my apartment, and there she was, standing in line at the customer service counter, arguing loudly with the clerk about a declined card. Her voice carried across the store, brittle with desperation. When she noticed me, she straightened, tried to regain composure, but I caught the flicker of humiliation in her eyes. "Emily," she said stiffly, "don't believe everything people say. Your father's been telling stories." I kept my tone measured. "No, Mom, he's been telling the truth. That's the difference." For a moment, her mouth opened as if to argue, but the words died there. Around us, shoppers pretended not to listen, but I could feel their curiosity pressing in. Linda grabbed her bag quickly, muttering, "People will see I was right eventually." But the truth was, people already saw, and they were turning away. In the weeks that followed, invitations stopped arriving for her. A bridge club she'd attended for years quietly cut her out. The neighbor she once bragged to about Sophie's prospects now avoided small talk. Even Sophie, drowning in her own marital tensions, had little patience left for Mom's endless defense. I learned most of this secondhand, but I didn't need to witness every detail. The pattern was clear. Linda was becoming an island, surrounded by walls she built herself. And still, she clung to her version of reality, refusing to admit the wreckage. To her, Sophie was a victim. Dad was a traitor, and I was the ungrateful daughter who turned everyone against her. But I no longer felt the urge to correct her. Watching her unravel wasn't satisfying, it was sobering. For the first time, I understood that her cruelty came from weakness, not strength. And weakness, when left unchecked, isolates more brutally than any punishment could. By the time Mom's circle had thinned to almost nothing, Sophie's glittering image was already cracking. At first, she ignored the gossip swirling after her wedding, calling it jealousy, dismissing every headline as fake news. But silence can be more damning than words, and slowly, people stopped returning her calls. It started with the boutique crowd in downtown Portland, the same influencers she once showered with free merchandise and lavish dinners. They moved on to newer ventures, leaving her texts unanswered. Then the couple she and her new husband had bragged about vacationing with canceled plans and never rescheduled. I didn't witness these unravelings directly, but the whispers found their way back to me through cousins, coworkers, even social media. A mutual acquaintance confided over coffee. She tried to host a brunch last week. Hardly anyone showed. It was embarrassing. One evening, scrolling absent-mindedly on my phone, I came across a video posted by someone at a downtown gala. Sophie was there, dressed to the nines, attempting to insert herself into a circle of old acquaintances. The clip was only seconds long, but it cut deep. She laughed too loudly, reached out to touch someone's arm, only for the group to shift subtly, closing the circle without her. The camera lingered on her forced smile before cutting away. Michael looked over my shoulder. She's unraveling. I set the phone down, my chest heavy. This isn't what I wanted. I just wanted them to stop punishing me for being responsible. But the truth was clear. Sophie's punishment was arriving without my hand in it. A few weeks later, I ran into her unexpectedly. It was at a local grocery store in Northwest Portland, not far from where she used to flaunt her luxury car and designer bags. She looked thinner, her once perfect hair pulled back in a messy bun, her cart filled with instant noodles and discount items. For a moment, she didn't see me. She argued softly with her husband over prices, her voice brittle, desperate. When she finally noticed me, her expression flickered. From pride to shame to something like fury, she forced a smirk. Well, if it isn't the golden child. Here to gloat? I kept my voice even. No, Sophie, I'm just here to buy groceries. Same as you. Her husband shifted uncomfortably, mumbling something about waiting in the car before leaving her alone with me. The sight of her standing there, abandoned even in a mundane errand, struck me harder than any of her insults ever had. You think everyone's turned against me, she said, lowering her voice now. But they'll come back. They always do. I met her eyes steady. Not if you keep blaming everyone else. At some point, Sophie, people stop clapping. Her lips trembled, but she turned away, muttering something I couldn't catch. She left the store without another word, her cart still half full in the aisle. As I watched her walk out, I realized the applause she had once demanded had finally gone silent. And unlike me, she didn't know how to live without it. When Sophie's glitter faded from the public eye, Michael and I were already pouring our energy into something quieter, sturdier, our own home. Not the kind of place that needed chandeliers or fountains to impress anyone, just walls strong enough to hold love, laughter, and the life we were building together. We found it on a rainy Saturday afternoon, a small craftsman-style house on the east side of Portland. The paint was chipped, the yard overgrown, but there was something about the wide porch and the way the windows opened to the light that made me pause. Michael slipped his arm around my waist. I can already see you planting sunflowers out front. I smiled. And you fixing that creaky step before I trip over it. The realtor hovered nearby, trying to pitch features, but I barely heard her. My heart was already whispering home. 2 months later, after stacks of paperwork and nervous late-night budgeting sessions, the keys were finally ours. The first night, we slept on a mattress in the middle of the empty living room, surrounded by unopened boxes. Rain pattered against the roof, and Michael reached for my hand. We did this ourselves, he murmured. I squeezed back. No one can take it away this time. Those words carried more weight than either of us said aloud. The weeks that followed were filled with paint-stained clothes, trips to the hardware store, and laughter echoing off bare walls. Friends stopped by with casseroles and second-hand furniture. Aunt Margaret brought over a quilt she'd sewn herself. Even Dad, still tentative but trying, helped us fix the broken railing on the back deck. One evening, after hanging string lights in the backyard, Michael and I sat on the porch steps, exhausted but content. He handed me a mug of tea. You know, he said, I used to think stability was boring, routine, predictable, but now I think it's the bravest thing we've built. I rested my head on his shoulder, letting the quiet of our street settle around us. For so long, my life had been chaos, shouting matches, accusations, betrayals. Now the silence was a kind of victory. Yet peace didn't erase the scars. Some nights I still woke from dreams of Mom's slap echoing through the restaurant, or Sophie's voice sneering at me in the courtroom. Michael would pull me close, whispering, "You're safe now," until the tremors passed. One Saturday morning, as I unpacked the last of our boxes, I found an old photo album tucked between stacks of books. Inside were pictures of family vacations, birthdays, smiles that now felt like strangers. I flipped through slowly until Michael appeared at my side. "You okay?" he asked softly. I nodded, though tears blurred the pages. I used to think these were proof of love. Now I see they were snapshots of survival. I don't want survival anymore. I want something real. He closed the album gently and slid it onto the shelf. Then that's what we'll build, day by day. Later that evening, as we hosted a small dinner with friends under those backyard string lights, I looked around at the mismatched chairs, the laughter spilling into the night, the warmth that came not from obligation, but choice. It struck me then. This was the family I had longed for, not bound by blood, but by respect, trust, and love freely given. Our house wasn't grand, but it was honest, and in its walls we weren't playing roles written by someone else. We were authors now, writing a story that no rumor or betrayal could erase. By the time our daughter Olivia turned 3, the little house Michael and I had poured ourselves into finally felt alive in every corner. Crayon drawings covered the fridge, a swing dangled from the backyard maple, and the sound of her laughter echoed like a song that healed every old wound. Her birthday party was small by design, just a few close friends, some of Michael's co-workers, and family members I trusted. Aunt Margaret arrived with a homemade cake, Jenna came with balloons, and neighbors filled the yard with easy warmth. I didn't want extravagance. I wanted joy without strings attached. As the kids raced across the lawn, I carried paper plates from the kitchen when Michael touched my arm. His voice was low. "Emily, he's here." I froze. "Who?" He tilted his head toward the front gate. Standing there, a little hesitant but holding a gift bag with both hands, was my father. Robert. For a moment, my breath caught. Part of me wanted to send him away, but another part, the one that remembered his trembling apology at the diner, his quiet effort with the deck railing, the documents he'd slipped to Claire, knew he had been trying. Slowly, I walked toward him. He cleared his throat. "I didn't want to intrude. I heard it was Olivia's birthday. I thought maybe I could see her, if that's okay." His voice cracked on the last word, and for the first time, he didn't look like the man who had stood silent beside Linda. He looked like a grandfather terrified of missing his chance. I studied him carefully. "Things aren't fixed, Dad. They can't be. Not overnight." He nodded quickly. "I know. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to start showing up in the ways I should have all along." Behind me, Olivia's giggle floated from the yard. She darted toward us in a yellow dress, clutching a half-deflated balloon. Her eyes landed on the gift bag. "Is that for me?" Robert's face lit with something raw, almost boyish. He crouched down, holding it out. "Yes, sweetheart. Happy birthday." She accepted it with the innocent joy only a child can muster, then bolted back toward the other kids, leaving him blinking fast, swallowing hard. I let out a long breath. "You can stay. But understand, this is about her, not about fixing the past in one afternoon." Relief flooded his features. "Thank you, Emily. That's more than I deserve." The rest of the afternoon, Robert stayed on the edges. He helped refill lemonade pitchers, tied balloons when they drifted loose, and even coaxed Olivia into letting him push her gently on the swing. Watching them together tugged at something complicated in me, grief for what I'd never had, but also hope for what she might. As the sun dipped and candles were lit on the cake, I caught Robert standing back, his hands clasped, tears shining as everyone sang. For once, he wasn't hiding behind Linda's shadow or Sophie's demands. He was just a grandfather, quietly grateful to be included. Later, as guests trickled out, he approached me by the porch. His voice was steady but soft. "I know I can't rewrite history, but maybe I can help write hers, if you'll let me." I didn't answer right away. I looked through the window at Olivia, frosting smeared across her cheeks as Michael cleaned her hands. She deserved truth, safety, and family that showed up without conditions. Finally, I nodded. "One step at a time, Dad. No promises. But if you keep showing up, maybe she'll know you differently than I did." His shoulders eased, and for the first time in years, I believed him. Aunt Margaret had always been the quiet glue in our fractured family, the one who tried to keep bridges from burning completely. So when she invited us to her 65th birthday dinner at a small country club just outside Portland, I knew the guest list would be complicated. Michael squeezed my hand as we walked into the softly lit hall, Olivia skipping ahead toward the dessert table. "You don't have to do this," he whispered. "I know," I said, scanning the room, "but I need to." I spotted Dad near the bar, speaking easily with a cousin. He caught my eye, gave a tentative nod, and returned to his conversation. That simple acknowledgement felt like progress. But then I saw her. Linda sat at a round table near the center, a glass of white wine in hand, dressed in her usual floral blazer as though nothing had changed. Yet there was a stiffness in her shoulders, an emptiness in the chair beside her. Sophie's absence was loud. For once, she looked smaller, not from age, but from the weight of being left alone. I hadn't spoken to her in nearly a year. Every fiber of me wanted to turn away, but Margaret's party wasn't the place for hiding, and maybe, just maybe, this was the confrontation I had been walking toward all along. When our eyes met, she straightened, masking whatever crack had shown with that familiar tight smile. "Emily," she said coolly as I approached. "You look, well." I sat across from her, keeping my voice steady. "I am well." Her smile faltered. "I heard Robert's been spending time with you, helping." The word dripped with disapproval. "I suppose he feels guilty." "He should," I replied calmly. "And so should you." For the first time, her composure slipped. "You've turned everyone against me, your cousins, your father. Even Sophie keeps her distance these days. You think that makes you strong?" I leaned forward, meeting her glare head-on. "No, Mom. What makes me strong is that I stopped letting you decide who I am. People didn't turn against you because of me. They turned because of your choices." She laughed bitterly, a sound that scraped against the polished air of the room. "Choices? Everything I did was to protect this family, to give Sophie the support she needed. She was fragile. She needed me. And I didn't?" My voice cracked, years of swallowed hurt surfacing. "You watched me carry myself through school, work, life, alone. And instead of being proud, you punished me for not needing you. That wasn't protection, that was cruelty." The table between us felt like a battlefield. Around us, other guests lowered their voices, pretending not to listen but clearly aware. Linda's eyes shimmered, but her pride hardened them. "I did what I thought was best." I shook my head slowly. "No, you did what was easiest for you. Blaming me kept you from facing Sophie's failures. But look where it led you. A foreclosed house, a fractured family, and an empty chair beside you tonight." Her breath hitched. For the briefest moment, the armor cracked, and I glimpsed fear, the realization of her own isolation. But just as quickly, she pulled herself together, lifting her chin. "You're cruel, Emily." I stood, my voice firm but not loud. "No, Mom, I'm finally honest, and honesty isn't cruelty, it's freedom." Silence stretched. Then I turned and walked away, my chest trembling but lighter than it had ever felt. Michael met me near the doorway, concern in his eyes. "You okay?" I exhaled deeply. For the first time, yes. As the evening wore on, I watched from a distance as Linda sat alone, no one drifting near her table for long. The isolation she had built for me all those years had finally circled back to her. Karma didn't roar. It whispered, quietly stripping her of the applause she'd always demanded. On the drive home, Olivia dozed in her car seat, clutching a balloon. I looked at her peaceful face, and felt something shift inside me. My battle with Linda was finished, not because she admitted fault, but because I no longer needed her to. I had chosen my family, my truth, my freedom, and nothing she could say would ever take that from me again. The weeks after Aunt Margaret's birthday felt strangely calm. For the first time in years, my life wasn't dictated by someone else's chaos. Our home pulsed with the sounds of Olivia's giggles, Michael's humming while he brewed coffee, and the creak of our old porch swing in the evening breeze. It was on a quiet Sunday afternoon, while Olivia was painting rainbows at the kitchen table, that my phone lit up with a name I hadn't expected to see again: Sophie. I stared at the screen, torn. Part of me wanted to let it ring out, but curiosity, and maybe the faint hope for closure, made me answer. Her voice was softer than I remembered. "Emily, I know I don't deserve your time, but please, can we meet? I need to say something to you face to face." I hesitated, then agreed, not for her sake, but for mine. We met at a riverside park in downtown Portland. The day was overcast, the Willamette gray and restless, like it carried all the words we'd left unsaid. Sophie arrived in plain jeans and a cardigan, her hair pulled back without the gloss and glamour she once paraded. She looked stripped of armor. She sat down on the bench across from me, clutching a paper cup. Her hands shook. "I've lost almost everything," she began, her voice trembling. "My marriage is falling apart. The friends I thought I had disappeared, and Mom, she's bitter and impossible to be around. For so long I told myself I was the chosen one, the special one. But the truth is, I was just her excuse, and I used that to hurt you." I said nothing. I let her sit in it. Tears welled in her eyes. I lied, I sabotaged, I humiliated you when all you ever did was stand on your own 2 feet. I can't take it back, but I need you to know, I'm sorry. Truly, I don't expect forgiveness. I couldn't carry the weight anymore. Her words hit harder than I expected. I had braced for excuses, but not this raw admission. I took a slow breath. "Sophie, what you did cut deep. Some of those wounds may never close. But I also know what it's like to live under Mom's shadow, to believe love has to be earned, fought for, stolen. If you're serious about changing, it's not about me forgiving you today. It's about proving, through time, through choices, that you can be different." She let out a shaky laugh, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "That's fair. More than I deserve." Just then, Olivia ran over, her little sneakers slapping against the path. She tugged on my hand, eyeing Sophie curiously. "Mommy? Who's that?" I looked at Sophie, who waited, almost afraid. I bent down to Olivia's height. "That's your aunt." Sophie crouched slowly, her voice tender. "Hi, Olivia." My daughter studied her, then grinned the way only children can, without history, without judgment. "Hi." She ran back toward Michael, leaving Sophie blinking fast, swallowing hard. Sophie stood, her voice low. "Maybe someday she'll know me differently than you did." I nodded. "That's up to you." We parted without promises, but with something else, a thin thread of possibility. That night, after Olivia fell asleep, I sat on the porch with Michael. The sky was streaked with stars, the air cool against my skin. For the first time in years, I felt free. Not because everything had been fixed, but because I no longer needed it to be. Looking back on everything, the courtroom fights, the slammed doors, the betrayals dressed as love, I realized the greatest victory wasn't proving anyone wrong. It was choosing myself, my peace, and the family I created. I once believed family was an obligation, a script written in blood that I had to follow no matter how much it hurt. Now I know better. Family is a choice. It's the people who stand beside you when storms hit, who celebrate your joy without envy, who love without asking you to shrink. My mother's cruelty taught me boundaries. My father's silence showed me the cost of not speaking up. And Sophie's apology reminded me that change, however fragile, is possible. But most of all, Olivia taught me what unconditional love looks like. She will never beg for approval the way I once did. she will grow up free. And to you, listening to my story, I hope you remember this. You don't need to earn love by suffering. You don't need to stay where you're diminished. You can build something better. If my journey resonated with you, please like, subscribe, share, and leave a comment. What does family mean to you? Let's start redefining it together.